Okay, good evening. Welcome to this AAPI Heritage Month webinar series. My name is Yuan Wen, your host tonight. The webinar series is presented by 4 leading organizations dedicated to advancing Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. They are Civic Leadership Academy, BRI Talks, 就是侨路基金会公益大讲堂 UCA 美国华人联合会 and 美华历史 Each year in May, the 4 organizations, together with other Chinese community organizations, will hold various talks of various types of talks and discussions to celebrate the contributions of the AAPI community in US, promote deeper understanding of its rich and diverse history, and discuss the challenges AAPI communities are facing. We hope, we have been doing this for a few years now. And this month, we'll explore various aspects of the AAPI experience, from the early days of trade between US and China to the ongoing fight for equity and representation, and the development of creative expression. Our aim is to celebrate the contributions of the AAPI community and promote a deep understanding of AAPI communities. So today we'll explore the fascinating history of trade between the United States and China, dating back to the 18th century. From tea and silk to opium and silver, the commerce between these 2 great nations has shaped the course of global economics and politics. So our distinguished speaker today, let me introduce Professor John Haddad. Professor Haddad is a professor of American Studies and Popular Culture at Penn State, Harrisburg. He's a distinguished scholar and researcher, and his paper, The Romance of China, Excursions to China in US Culture from 1776 to 1876, won the prestigious Gutenberg Award in 2002. In 2010, he was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to teach and conduct research at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Haddad is also the author of the book, America's First Adventure in China, Trade, Treaties, Opium, and Salvations. We are really honored to have him as our speaker today. Please welcome Professor Haddad.
Thank you, Juan, for that wonderful introduction. And it is a real honor to be speaking to all of you in celebration of AAPI Heritage Month. I'm delighted to see you all here tonight, wherever you are. This presentation, as one just explained, is on early US-China trade, and it has a focus on opium. I'm going to go ahead here and share my screen. All right. All right, Juan, is that coming across okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the title of the presentation, The American Opium Trade in China, Merchants, Missionaries, Mandarins, and the Self-Made Man. This presentation will focus on the period between 1784 and 1839. Why those dates? Well, the year 1784 marks the entrance of the United States into the China trade. Before that year, the British East India Company conveyed all the tea that Americans consumed. And the tea dumped in Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party, that was Chinese tea brought by the East India Company. Our closing date, 1839, marks the start of the Opium War. The opium trade continued after the war, of course. However, China had lost control of its borders in the 1840s. And once that happened, the opium trade took on a fundamentally different appearance. So within that time frame, we will be exploring 3 questions tonight. First question, why did Americans pursue the opium trade? Second, how did the opium trade work? And third, how was the opium trade connected to the American dream? All right, so let's address that first question. The short version is that opium solved a very real problem, one that I can encapsulate in 3 short bullets. First, Americans consumed vast quantities of tea. Second, all tea at this time came from China. And so you can, if you look here at this slide, you can see that back in the 19th century, cities had big tea stores to serve customers. There was really a national obsession with tea, much like I suppose our obsession with coffee today. So we're looking here at these just large stores dedicated entirely to tea. And the third bullet, China wanted almost nothing made by or grown in the United States. So there's your 3 bullets, and that's the problem. The problem, in short, was a trade imbalance, and it was not a small one either. In fact, the British, who had the same problem, regarded it as so severe as to prompt an exchange between monarchs. In 1793, King George III sent an embassy to China. It's called the Macartney Mission, and its purpose was to formally ask Emperor Qianlong to open up China's commerce with England. Specifically, King George wanted new ports opened for trade. He wanted a small island that could serve as a base for English traders, and he wanted commercial restrictions to be relaxed. Well, guess what? Emperor Qianlong rebuffed him. In rejecting all requests, Qianlong explained the one-way street that was the Sino-British trade. So here we have a direct quote from the emperor in his letter to King George. He says, China possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was, therefore, no need to import the manufactures of the outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. But as the tea, silk, and porcelain which China produces are absolute necessities to European nations and to yourselves, we have permitted that the foreign hongs, which is to say the commercial warehouses, should be established at Canton, that's Guangzhou, so that your wants might be supplied. In other words, nothing happened as the result of that embassy. Emperor Qianlong insisted that the status quo would remain. Now, Qianlong did not specify what foreign traders should use to pay for their tea, silk, and porcelain. However, he surely meant silver. Silver was the closest thing to an international currency back then. Most silver in circulation originated in South America, where the Spanish oversaw vast mining projects aimed at extracting the ore that could be minted into coins. Though silver coins were easy to transport and convenient to exchange, they were also precious. England did not have enough silver, and China's other big tea customer, the United States, had even less. So that was the problem. But it did not deter the United States when it first ventured into the China trade. That happened in 1784. To say that the United States was a new nation would be an understatement. When the Empress of China embarked for Asia out of New York, the ink was still drying on the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. Though this vessel carried some silver, its main cargo was ginseng. The French, who you may remember were allies with the Americans during the Revolutionary War, the French had told the Americans that the Chinese took ginseng for health reasons. And when the Americans heard that, they said, yippee, that's wonderful, because this root grows in the wild in the Appalachian mountain range. You could have almost as much of it as you wanted for free. Some Americans believed that God himself had blessed America's China trade by giving its merchants the perfect commodity to exchange for tea. England would have to spend precious silver, but not the lucky Americans. They could fill their ships with this once thought to be useless root and sell it to the Chinese and get tea as a result. Well, when the Empress of China reached Canton, Chinese merchants did purchase this cargo of ginseng. However, future demand would be limited. The Chinese grew their own variety of ginseng, which they preferred. So you could carry some ginseng to China, but ginseng would not become the miracle trade good that many hoped it would be. The China trade, thus, looked like this at the very beginning. All right, so take a look at this slide. You can see one arrow going from left to right. That's what American traders are bringing to China. And you can see that it's a lot of silver, which again is hard to get, and a little bit of ginseng. So it's mostly silver. Now going in the other direction, mostly tea, but also some porcelain and some silk. Well, the traders did not quit. In fact, ginseng was first in a long line of exotic products on which Americans pinned their hopes. Instead of sailing directly for China, American traders would adopt multi-stop itineraries that took them all over the globe searching for trade goods. So you can see they usually start on the east coast of the United States, head south, go around South America, and they're stopping along the way to pick up things that they believe the Chinese want to buy, and in fact they do. There's furs and pelts and sandalwood and swallows' nests and sea slugs, which was called or is called bêche de mer. Again, the traders are looking for something that the Chinese want so that they don't have to pay for their tea using silver. Unfortunately, every exotic product, though selling well in China for a period, possessed some kind of a fatal flaw. Merchants transported otter furs from the Pacific Northwest and seal skins from the islands off of South America. And though the Chinese happily bought these up and they used them to make warm coats, the fur trade depended on the mass slaughter of animals that could not reproduce fast enough to keep up with demand. And so the fur trade, I think along with being cruel, was also unsustainable. So too was the sandalwood trade. Sandalwood is a kind of tree indigenous to Hawaii, Fiji, and a few other South Pacific islands. China's appetite for this soft and fragrant wonder wood was insatiable. They couldn't get enough of it. The people used it in furniture and in chopsticks and burned it during religious rituals. When word of China's demand got out, sandalwood mania gripped the entire China trade. Now, there's a problem with sandalwood. You cannot harvest sandalwood like you would tea. With tea, you pick the leaves, but you leave the tree standing for many years to come. The same tea tree can be used or can produce tea harvests year after year after year. With sandalwood, the whole tree must be chopped down, and the world's supply of these trees was finite. In the space of just a few years, in the early 1800s, ancient primordial forests that were thousands of years in the making got destroyed. It was one of the China trade's ecological horror stories. Resourceful traders also stole swallows' nests from the steep ocean cliffs of Indonesia, Java, and Borneo, because Chinese like to make soup out of this bird's nest. And they scooped up sea slugs from their coastal habitats because the Chinese regarded these, that's the bêche de mer, as a delicacy also. Well, obtaining exotic goods required a lot of effort and long sailing voyages. Often, young men would leave their homes for 3 or 4 years. Since none of these exotic goods came close to offsetting America's love for tea, the trade imbalance persisted. There was still a steady current of silver flowing into China, which you can see here. Yeah, the exotic products, they helped a little bit, but you can still see the Americans are losing silver with their trade. Now, the British at last found the great equalizer, and that's opium. Opium from India. Unlike exotic goods, opium possessed no fatal flaw, at least not on the supply side. Opium was addictive, meaning that demand in China would never decline. And since the poppy plant, unlike sandalwood, could be harvested, supplies would never be depleted. England, in short, balanced its China trade by getting the Chinese hooked on a narcotic. To illustrate this balance, I'm going to put 2 slides side by side here. All right, what are we looking at here? Well, we are in Canton here in a large warehouse where the Chinese are packing tea for export to England. So you can see they're selling tea in large volume. But the English are selling opium in large volume too. Now we are in India, and what we see here is a vast opium warehouse where each one of those spheres is called an opium ball, and that's going to go to China. So there's large volume going in each direction. Opium to China, tea to England. Now, some American traders wanted in on the opium trade. They wanted a piece of this business. However, they faced a barrier: English protectionism. In the early 1800s, the British East India Company enacted 2 measures to preserve its monopoly in Indian-grown opium. First, it forbade traders from other nations, the United States included, from partaking of the India to Canton conveyance of opium. That lucrative business was reserved for English traders. Second, to protect the market for Indian opium, the East India Company prevented British traders from handling non-Indian opium. All right, so if you're an English trader, you cannot get opium from any other place. You can only transport Indian opium to China. So these 2 measures worked. they did keep Americans away from Indian opium. However, the two measures also created an opportunity. If Americans could locate a second source for opium, they could enjoy free reign over it. There would be no British competition. They did exactly that. They found that second source, Turkey. It was Philadelphia's merchants who first identified Turkey as a potential supplier of opium. In 1804, a man named William Stewart, he was the US consul in Smyrna, Turkey, he left his post and returned home to Philadelphia carrying important news. He had figured out or learned that you could buy opium in Turkey. He shared the news with William Waln, who's a trader, and a partner named R.H. Wilcox. To test the waters, these two partners sent a vessel to Smyrna, where it did obtain a cargo of opium. However, before consummating the venture in Canton, the captain of the vessel lost his nerve and he sold his opium to the British when he ran into them in Indonesia. All right, well, Waln decided to try again, and the same partner's next opium ship successfully reached Canton in 1806, becoming the first American opium venture on record. So if you want to know the date when the American opium trade began, it's 1806. Other merchants heard the news and they jumped into the Turkish opium trade themselves. All right, all of that was for the first question, why did the Americans enter the trade? So they wanted to balance, they wanted to find a trade imbalance or address the trade imbalance. Now, second question, how did the opium trade work? In other words, how did they smuggle opium into China? Obviously, you could not just sail into Canton and unload it because opium was prohibited by the Chinese government. It was contraband. Before we examine the smuggling operation, let's look for a moment at how the legitimate trade worked before the Opium War. So we're going to look at regular trade, not illegal trade. All right, what you're looking at here is a region called the Pearl River Delta. And you can see Hong Kong and Macau down below and Canton up north. So let's say you are approaching China in a ship carrying a legal cargo. So you don't have any opium. You can't just sail straight to Canton unless you want to be the ugly American. Instead, once you arrive in the Pearl River Delta, you have to pull over, so to speak, in Macau. And here's a lovely painting of Macau from the early to mid 19th century. In Macau, you would check in and take on a Chinese pilot, somebody who knew the Pearl River very, very well. Now your captain, the captain who had brought you this far, he steps aside and the Chinese pilot guides the vessel up the river. Okay, so you stop in Macau and now you go through the Pearl River Delta and up the river towards Canton. The pilot stops at various places along the way to check in. And finally, you anchor at Whampoa. And here's Whampoa there. And it is in Whampoa that 3 important Chinese men board your vessel. The first one to board is the Hapo. And the Hapo is the commissioner of the Board of Revenue. And you have to give him something called a sing-song, a sing-song. What was it? It was a gift for the emperor. So you have to provide the emperor with some kind of gift, usually perhaps a mechanical clock or something like that. and the Hapo would send it up to Beijing. The Hapo's primary task, along with collecting the gift, was to examine your vessel and calculate the port fees, find out how much you owed. Next, you would meet a man named called a linguist. And the linguist's job had nothing to do with language. What he did is create an inventory of your trade, a long list of everything that you brought that you want to sell and everything that you're buying that you want to take away. So if you were foolish enough to have opium on board your vessel, he might find it. Third and last, you would meet a Hong merchant. This is your trading partner. This man will buy your cargo and he will sell you the tea, the porcelain, and the silk that you want. So all your trade goes through him. Very interesting person, the Hong merchant. At any given time, there were only between 8 and 13 Hong merchants in Canton. So between these, roughly a dozen men, they handled all of China's vast trade with Europe and America. Some of these men became fabulously wealthy. Some historians estimate that the central figure there, Haokua, was the wealthiest man on planet Earth, not including kings and queens. But it was high stakes trade, and other Hong merchants didn't do as well as Haokua. Some of them fell in debt. Some of them lost all their money. They failed. Regardless, you can see that if you were a Hong merchant, it was important to have your portrait done either by George Chinnery, see him in the lower left, who was a British expatriate, a great painter, or Lam Qua, lower right, a Chinese painter who studied under George Chinnery and then proceeded to steal a lot of George Chinnery's business for portraits. All right, while your cargo in Whampoa was being unloaded, you would proceed to a place called the Foreign Factories, a small commercial zone on the edge of Canton. In this slide, you can see the foreign factories kind of in the lower center, and the city of Canton with its walls right behind it. So you can only go to these foreign factories. You can't go anywhere else. And the foreign factories are quite small, only about 400 yards long and 300 yards wide. So the foreign factories covered only 1/25 of a square mile. Now that's not bad if you're only staying for a few weeks before departing with your cargo of tea. But some traders were stationed there for years and years by their companies. A few of them lived in this cramped space for a decade or more, 10 years without leaving. All right, here's another view of the foreign factories. I should state briefly that this trading procedure that I just outlined, stopping in Macau, going to Canton, and so on, it's what historians call the Canton system. The Canton system involved rules that you had to follow if you did not want to get expelled from China. So there's just a few basic rules. First, you could trade only in Canton. You were forbidden from sailing up the coast to, say, Fuzhou or Xiamen. Second, you could only trade with the Hong merchants. Now, this one really hurt because they were essentially glorified middlemen. They did not grow tea themselves. They didn't make porcelain themselves. They purchased their tea from the great inland tea merchants. And when they sold the tea to you, they marked it up and took their cut. Third, you could not bring women or children into Canton. China was mostly a closed country at this time, and the government wanted you to come, conduct your business, and leave. China didn't want you to settle down with your wife and kids. There were some wives who lived in Macau while their husbands traded in Canton. Macau being a Portuguese settlement. So that was the legitimate trade, what I just described there. Now, how does it change when a ship arrives bearing opium? Well, smugglers employed several different systems over the years, and that's because the Chinese government would periodically order a crackdown and force the opium smugglers to devise a new system to circumnavigate the law. There were some years, especially early on, when smuggling opium was pretty easy. All you would do was sail into Whampoa and you would bribe an official, pay the official some money, and the official would look the other way while you were unloading the opium to the Chinese buyers. So that was the easiest, but that didn't last for very long. I'm going to describe the system that was used for many years by the largest American opium trader in the early 19th century, Thomas Perkins and Company. All right. So now you're arriving and you have opium. So here's how it worked. For starters, if you are the captain of the ship, you do not stop in Macau and you do not allow your ship to be processed. Instead, you veer over to a little island there in the middle of the Pearl River Delta called Linton Island, and you weigh anchor there. The larger opium smugglers, like Thomas Perkins and Company, had agents who lived permanently up in the foreign factories. For Thomas Perkins and Company, for many, many years, that agent was John Perkins Cushing. And Cushing surreptitiously handled money transactions with Chinese smugglers. So when your ship reached Linton, a small Chinese boat would approach. It was called a fast crab. And in this slide, you can see the larger opium vessels and the smaller Chinese craft. As captain, you would hand this small Chinese boat a piece of paper that carried a coded message that was intended for your Canton agent. So the coded message that Thomas Perkins and Company used was the word gum. Yeah, just like chewing gum. But gum didn't mean chewing gum. Gum was code for opium. So once this paper reached the agent, John Perkins Cushing, in Canton, he knew that you were waiting in Linton with your opium. He would then inform his Chinese buyer, who would send out a boat for a clandestine visit to Linton to receive the opium he had already purchased from Cushing. Your crew would literally hand the opium over the side of the boat. At this point, the narcotic was in the hands of a Chinese smuggling network who would take it from there. And there's other historians who know how that whole system worked. Now, once your opium stores were depleted, so you're out of opium, you could set sail. So you're going to leave Linton. And let's say that you also brought some legal goods that you wanted to trade. Well, you would head over to Macau and initiate the legitimate trade with China and maybe sail back to Boston or New York with some tea and silk. However, the larger trading firms, like Thomas Perkins and Company, would station a big ship permanently at Linton. They called it a receiving vessel, but it was really a floating narcotics warehouse. The captain and crew of this ship would live on board for months or even years dispensing opium. The company's other ships would arrive periodically to replenish the supply of opium. So it just sits there for years. It brought opium, and when it runs out of opium, other ships will come and give it more opium. the big companies like Thomas Perkins and Company had other advantages. I mentioned John Perkins Cushing before. He was an interesting figure in the China trade. I'll tell you a little bit about him. After his father died when he was young, his uncle, who was Thomas Perkins, sent him to Canton in 1803 at the age of 16. He was supposed to apprentice under an older and more experienced man named Ephraim Bumstead. So Ephraim Bumstead is supposed to be the agent, the Canton agent. Unfortunately, Ephraim Bumstead got sick and died, leaving all of Thomas Perkins and Company's huge trade in the hands of John Perkins Cushing, in the hands of a teenager. What could go wrong, right? Actually, though, Cushing performed extremely well. He got good at the China trade. He lived in Canton in the foreign factories for more than a quarter of a century, 25 years, and he capably managed his uncle's China trade. He became very, very good friends with Haokua, the Hong merchant I mentioned a moment ago, the richest man in the world. And sadly, John Perkins Cushing was very, very good at manipulating the opium market. Cushing demoralized his competitors in the opium trade by exploiting the fact that Perkins purchased opium in very high volume. When a rival arrived in the Pearl River Delta with opium, that man had unwittingly drifted into an artificially controlled price chamber. As that guy prepared to sell his cargo, he witnessed a sudden and mysterious drop in the price of opium that wiped out his anticipated profit. What was going on? Well, unbeknownst to him, Cushing had released a large quantity of his own opium into the market, driving down the price. At this juncture, the newcomer, he's screwed. He either unloaded his opium for a loss, or he would sell it to Cushing at a discount. Now, once that transaction was final, the trader would watch, dumbfounded, shocked, as the price of opium proceeded to rise again without apparent cost. Obviously, Cushing behind the scenes could control, because his company sold so much opium, he could control the price. All right, finally, we have reached the third and the last question, which ties opium to upward mobility and the American dream. Many of you have read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, perhaps in high school, perhaps in college. If so, or maybe you saw the Robert Redford movie or the recently Leonardo DiCaprio. If you did, you remember that Jay Gatsby did not start out rich. He started out as a poor boy. He became wealthy by taking a shortcut to the American dream. Instead of working hard and saving money, he became a bootlegger during Prohibition in the 1920s. So when alcohol was illegal, he sold alcohol illegally, the bootlegger. Well, many of our opium traders were also pursuing a perverted version of the American dream. They did not start out rich, but they became affluent or sometimes extremely wealthy through this illegal commerce. John Perkins Cushing became one of the richest men in New England by the time he retired in 1830. And his uncle, Thomas Perkins, was also obscenely rich. So opium enabled the upward mobility of these two, but also other members of the Perkins clan or family. Probably no American handled as much of the narcotic as Robert Bennett Forbes. So Forbes was Thomas Perkins's nephew. So he's John Perkins Cushing's cousin. So he's related to a very wealthy man, but there was no silver spoon in his childhood. By the time he reached boyhood, his father had already failed in life. Thomas Perkins, recognizing his sister's predicament, trying to raise these boys without any money, took a special interest in her sons. After observing young Robert Bennett Forbes, Perkins concluded that the boy had a very sharp mind and a very adventuresome spirit. One fateful day in 1817, Perkins took his 13-year-old nephew on a seemingly innocent stroll along the wharf in Boston. Out of the blue, Perkins asked his nephew to pick a ship to sail on. He's like, yeah, I have an army. I have a whole army of ships. Pick one. Well, Forbes pointed to one and said, I'm ready to go on that one. And to his delight, Thomas Perkins made immediate arrangements to send his nephew out as the cabin boy on that vessel. So in China, when Forbes arrived, he apprenticed under John Perkins Cushing, his cousin, to learn the family business. And on subsequent voyages, he worked his way up the ladder of command. He was second mate on one of his early voyages. Then he became first mate, and then he became captain. He became captain at the young age of 20. Though captaining ships was satisfying, opium took hold of Forbes's imagination in the 1820s. It grafted itself onto his dreams. Specifically, he aspired to captain the receiving vessel that would drop anchor at Linton and disperse opium. Recalling this dream, Forbes later said, quote, I had looked forward to the command of the Linton station ship as the summit, the high point of my ambition. Forbes also remembered that magical night that his dream came true. Uncle Thomas Perkins agreed to commission a new ship for Linton and install Forbes as the captain. The ship's name, I guess appropriately but unimaginatively, was the Linton. So the ship that was going to Linton was also named the Linton. Recalling this night, Forbes wrote, quote, I do not recall any night of my life when I have been blessed with more happy dreams of prosperity. Yes, there was a lot of money to be had. Now, this would be an uplifting story were it not for the fact that the ship, the Linton, existed solely to pump narcotics into China. In other words, Forbes's rise in the world required untold numbers of Chinese to fall to ruin. The true scope of the tragedy comes into finer focus when we realize that Forbes was not an outlier. Lots of people were doing this. Most traders based their upward mobility plans on opium. Though a few secured vast wealth in China, the majority sought what was called a competency. A competency ranged from around $100,000 to $200,000. And a competency allowed a trader and his family to live the rest of their lives, not obscenely rich, but without financial worry. You were comfortable for the rest of your life. When we recognize that many merchants sought competencies rather than fortunes, we can understand opium's seductive power. Let me explain that. Most China traders did not enjoy the long voyages to China, where tedious days at sea were punctuated by foul food and rancid drinking water. In Canton, they viewed their cooped-up sojourn as an exile, and they longed to go home. they deeply resented the Chinese government, which handicapped their trade with that heavy-handed Canton system that I described a moment ago. The traders yearned for a more open China where they could trade at multiple ports and buy directly from the inland tea merchants, no middleman. They believed that the Chinese government, by suppressing their profits, was slowing their progress toward that elusive goal, the competency. Frustrated, these traders looked favorably upon any commodity, even a contraband one, an illegal one, that could accelerate their profit making and hasten their return home from exile. There was one trader, William Hunter, and he worked for the powerful New England firm Russell and Company, probably the most powerful in the entire 19th century. He said that traders became addicted to opium sales, much like the Chinese became addicted to opium itself. He wrote, "The transactions seemed to partake of the nature of the drug. They imparted a soothing frame of mind." What he's getting at is that China traders, they got hooked. They got addicted to easy profits selling opium. Now, many of them did get rich thanks to opium. However, it came at a cost to their reputations in Canton. You saw how small the foreign factories were. So in this very small community, everybody knew exactly who was smuggling opium and who was clean. So opium caused a big divide. Let's look at this community for a moment. Now, we've already met some of the opium traders, but it wasn't just traders living there. There were also a handful of missionaries living in Canton trying to save souls. Here's the three most important ones. These men despised the opium trade for the following reason. They were not making progress with respect to conversions for several reasons. But one big problem was that the Chinese people linked opium and Christianity. The Chinese associated the foreign religion with the foreign drug, and they refused to trust anyone who came from a country that was also importing opium. So missionaries could not make any headway. They saved very few souls. They got very few people interested in Christianity, and they blamed the opium traders. Probably they were right. Other traders, not all American traders had their hands in the opium trade. There were some law-abiding merchants, like David Oliphant on the left, and his partner, Charles King. These clean merchants were Christian. In fact, David Oliphant gave missionaries free passage to China, and he gave them a residence in the foreign factories. So that's really what made the missionary possible. You didn't have to pay to get to China, and you didn't have to pay to live in China. Oliphant took care of that. Now, Oliphant, King, and others scolded the opium traders for earning their wealth illegally at the expense of Chinese lives and in violation of Christian morality. Practically speaking, they worried that the opium smugglers were giving all American traders a bad name with Chinese officials, and that these dishonest traders would cause a massive crackdown that would jeopardize the trade for everyone. So the opium traders were breaking the law, but everyone would get punished. And actually, there were times where an American opium trader got caught by the Chinese government, and the Chinese government shut down the entire trade. Opium traders believed that these critics, these two gentlemen right here, were sanctimonious, arrogant. They derisively called Oliphant Holy Joe, and they called the residence where Oliphant and the missionaries lived Zion's Corner. Oliphant may have been self-righteous, but at least he could sleep at night. That was one benefit to to conducting an honest trade, but there were other benefits to being clean. This guy is one of the most fascinating people I ever researched. His name's Nathan Dunn. He was a Quaker from Philadelphia, and he headed to China with no money. Actually, worse than that, he was in debt. He owed a lot of money. But in Canton, where he lived for over a decade, he ran a very careful trade focusing on silks that netted him a fabulous fortune. He made a ton of money. And he used some of that money in the most interesting of ways. He was what you would call a compulsive collector. He liked collecting things. And he started purchasing Chinese artifacts. Anything Chinese, he wanted to buy it. Chinese officials who appreciated his anti-opium stand helped him acquire objects from all over China for his collection. So even though Nathan Dunn was forbidden from leaving Canton, his collection represented the entire nation. It was probably the greatest collection on earth. I know the British East India Company tried to build a Chinese collection themselves, but they couldn't. They didn't do as well as this single man, and he did well, again, because the Chinese liked him. In 1832, he left Canton, he sailed home for Philadelphia, and in 1838, he opened up a Chinese museum in Philadelphia, which is one of the coolest things I've ever studied. It caused a sensation. Everyone wanted to go there. People would take, would travel from New York and Washington and Baltimore to visit the Chinese Museum. In 1842, he moved his exhibit to London, where it achieved great influence after the Opium War. In fact, Nathan Dunn was there, and he gave Queen Victoria a guided tour of the exhibit. So Nathan Dunn, in short, got wealthy because of the China trade. However, it was his anti-opium stand that helped him become influential through his museum. Well, let's return to the upward mobility of the opium traders. When John Perkins Cushing retired in 1830, Russell and Company became the dominant firm. That was because Cushing, before he left Canton for good, engineered a merger of sorts between the firms of Samuel Russell and Thomas Perkins. According to the agreement, Perkins would continue to send ships to Canton, where Russell and Company would handle their cargoes. As one stipulation of the deal, Russell was required to give a plum position to John Murray Forbes. This is Robert Bennett Forbes's younger brother. When John Murray started in Canton in the 1830s, Hauqua befriended him immediately. They really hit it off. Prudent, circumspect, and careful with money, John Murray Forbes was the mirror image of Hauqua himself. Hauqua even agreed to give all of his business to Russell and Company. He didn't trade with anybody else, on one condition: Forbes must handle his account. Now, it turned out that John Murray Forbes was excellent at wealth management. In the 1830s, he took control of the finances of his wasteful older brother, Robert Bennett, who was talented in all things nautical. He could sail a ship, but he was very irresponsible with money. So that decade, the 1830s, Robert Bennett would travel to China a couple times because he kept blowing through competencies meant to last his entire lifetime, but he'd blow through them in a couple years. In 1836, John Murray Forbes returned to Boston for good, where he planned to live a quiet life managing Hauqua's investment portfolio and his own. Yeah, he became kind of like the financial agent of Hauqua. But word of John Murray's financial acumen got around. Other former China traders, looking for someone to invest their money, turned to John Murray Forbes. And eventually, the semi-retired Forbes found himself controlling the spigot of one of the world's largest private capital flows. He was BlackRock of the 1830s and 40s. Though the story is too long to repeat here, Forbes channeled a lot of this capital into railroad construction. Smart. And no mere investor, Forbes actually funded, built, managed, and served as president of one of the nation's largest east-west rail systems, the Michigan Central. So the Michigan Central wasn't just a Michigan railroad. You can see it went all the way to the East Coast. Now, say what you will about Forbes. Yeah, he made a lot of money because of opium transactions, but he did some good things with his money and with his life. Before the Civil War, he became an ardent abolitionist who donated a lot of money to fund anti-slavery causes, including the Underground Railroad. So he was an abolitionist. And in the 1870s, he supported Chinese immigrants during the anti-Chinese movement. And that movement, you may know, culminated with the Exclusion Act of 1882. A horrible chapter, but John Murray Forbes is on the right side of history there. The case of John Murray Forbes helps us to understand the massive impact of the China trade. By the 1700s, China had developed a vast agricultural, industrial, commercial engine to supply its own burgeoning population. So again, in the 1700s, China had this sophisticated economy. When American merchants sent ships to Canton to purchase their tea, silk, and porcelain, they tapped into the enormous capacity of China's economic engine. When these same merchants sold their Chinese cargoes on the American market, they converted Chinese goods into US dollars, accumulating piles of capital in the process. Not content to sit on that money, they shrewdly invested it in railroads and in factories. In this way, we can imagine the China trade, including its illegal side, as a mighty transfer pump, one that shifted economic power from China to the United States. The capital that this trade fueled, the capital from this trade fueled America's industrial revolution after the Civil War and made many former China traders extremely rich. But as traders got richer, China grew poorer. That is because by 1837, opium accounted for over half of all of China's imports. And to pay for their opium, the Chinese spent ever larger quantities of silver. Between 1828 and 1836, historians say opium sales drained about $38 million of silver out of the Chinese economy. As China hemorrhaged silver in the south, alarm bells sounded up north in Beijing. In 1839, the emperor decided that the magnitude of the crisis called for drastic action. He sent Lin Zexu to Canton to deal with the problem, and you probably know what happened. There was a standoff in Canton involving the British, and that led eventually to the Opium War later that year, 1839. From the historian's perspective, there was one good thing about Robert Bennett Forbes, and that was he was very outspoken and he wrote a lot. Thanks to his memoir and his surviving letters, we can learn what he thought of his opium dealings at different stages of his life. When Forbes was young, he does not seem to have seriously contemplated the moral consequences of his actions. That the British government and respectable New England merchants all engaged in the opium trade, it legitimized it in his mind. He said, "I considered it right to follow the example of England and the merchants who were all," he said, exponents of an honorable trade. So the opium trade, it was an honorable trade. Why? Because honorable people did it, the people he respected. That's a young for Forbes. Now, let's see what he says later in life. In the early 1880s, when he's now in his mid-70s, he's getting to be an old man. He writes this. He says, in 1839, the Chinese government became aroused, not so much by the moral effect on the people who smoked the drug, as by the large amount of silver specie going out of the country to pay for it. But, in fact, most of the cash received for it went to pay for tea and silk, so that there was no large drain of silver specie by reason of the opium traffic. As to the effect on the people, there can be no doubt that opium was demoralizing to a certain extent, but not more so, probably, than the use of ardent spirits, alcohol. It was viewed as a legitimate business so long as the drug was sold on the coast outside of the professed jurisdiction of China. Okay, that was a mouthful. Let's break it down here. What's Forbes up to? Well, he is trying to exonerate himself. He's trying to say he shouldn't be blamed. And he does so by making three basic points. First, he says China did not lose much silver because the Chinese paid for their opium using tea and silk and not silver. Now, I think Chinese historians have shown that that's not true, that China really did lose a lot of silver. Second, Forbes admits that opium is bad for you, but it's no worse than alcohol, and alcohol is perfectly legal and is consumed everywhere. Third, he says we didn't violate any laws because opium dealing is illegal only in China, and we sold the stuff outside of China's borders. You know, Lytton, I guess, was outside of China's borders. So what we have here is an old man protecting his reputation. And I will add that these 3 points, you see all opium traders make the same 3 points. It's as if there's a textbook that you could use to justify your opium trade later in life. All right, if all we had at our disposal were the reflections of young Forbes and old Forbes, we could not possibly explore his conscience in a meaningful way. Fortunately, we also have middle-aged Forbes. When Forbes was in his mid-30s, his youthful idealism had worn off, but the self-protecting tendencies of affluence had not yet set in. In 1839, right when Lin Zexu was starting his crackdown in Canton, Forbes was there, and he wrote a letter to his wife. And in this letter, he offered his unvarnished opinion. So you can imagine she's at home in Boston, he's in Canton. Lin Zexu and the British are in the newspapers in America, and Forbes is telling his wife what the truth is so that she can speak to friends when they asked her. Okay, he says, I will tell you something about the opium trade so that you may speak learnedly. The trade, he confessed, has been demoralizing the minds, destroying the bodies, and draining the country of money. Now, that is the closest thing to an admission of guilt that you will ever see from an opium smuggler. Now, Forbes closed the letter by reminding his wife that his first fortune had been based entirely on opium sales, and that complicated his message. So he said, yes, opium did damage China. That was true. However, opium also is what made, it accelerated my rise in the world. And it's what I'm using now to try to earn another competency. So if it comes up, be careful in what you say. Other New England traders also knew to hush when the subject of opium was raised. In the 1870s, Forbes planned to write a history of Russell and Company. And remember, Russell and Company was the dominant firm of the 19th century. To get the ball rolling, Forbes contacted over 100 former colleagues to solicit their recollections. The response was underwhelming. Warren Delano of Massachusetts, and that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather, sent a skeletal outline of his career with Russell that made no mention of opium. And that was one of the better submissions that Forbes received. So why had these ex-traders suddenly adopted a close-lipped policy? Well, in the 1870s, these men headed prominent families and enjoyed reputations as philanthropists who backed many of the important social causes of the day. Oh, if you walk around Boston or Cambridge, where Harvard is, you're going to find buildings named after these people. These men had achieved the wealth and respectability of the American dream. And with their collective silence, they sent Forbes an unmistakable message. Nobody wanted to revisit the past. Nobody wanted to talk about where the money had truly come from. Their reticence prompted Forbes to rethink this book that he was trying to write. And he says, "The only thing I fear is that in giving a sketch of the causes and effects of the opium traffic, I may say too much." In the end, Forbes dropped the project, never wrote the book. And when he did, his former colleagues probably sighed with relief. And I'm going to guess you are sighing with relief because I am finally finished with this presentation. Thank you so much for being a great audience. I do want to show you one more slide, however, and that is if you have any questions that you don't get to tonight, how to reach me. I teach American Studies at Penn State Harrisburg. There's my email. Please feel free to write. And also, as one said in his introduction, I've written a few books. This material tonight came from one of my books, and I have 2 books with Temple University Press. And if you wish to purchase one, don't pay full price. All you have to do is put in this code there, CCOL23, and you will get a 25% discount. I also put that in the chat. All right. I'm going to stop the share there.
Yeah,
thank you
John.
very much.
Yeah. That's very informative. You know, from like I'm from mainland China, right? From our history book, we usually, when referring to opium trade, we always know that it was British, right?
Yes, that's right, and that's not true. Right, I mean, I remember reading that when I started out. The history books focused only on the British.
Yeah.
And the British did more. Certainly, they were in the trade longer. I think they started in the late 1700s. They did the trade longer, and they did conduct a larger trade. But I suspect the American opium trade was 10 or 20% of the total, maybe higher even.
Okay, yeah. And then after I came to the United States and started to learn that like Cushing family, Forbes family, you know, Gatsby, something about the opium thing. Yeah, and thank you very much for this very informative talk.
Sure.
So just I see like 2 questions in the Q&A, and from the audience, if you have any questions or comments, please just put it in Q&A or in the chat, and Professor Haddad will answer them. And I guess right now we have 2.
Oh yeah, I can see the questions.
Yeah.
So the first question, opium trade in California, name was Burlingame. Yeah, Burlingame. I have a whole chapter on Anson Burlingame in the book, and he's a remarkable person. He was under Abraham Lincoln, appointed him American ambassador to China in the 1860s. He loved China. He loved the Chinese. And he became good friends in the 1860s and 1870s with many of the Chinese officials with whom he worked. This was during the self-strengthening movement. Mm-hmm. And he was instrumental in convincing his British and French and German colleagues not to use gunboat diplomacy so much with the Chinese. In other words, not to threaten the Chinese with force when you needed something, but rather to work with the Chinese to come up with a solution. There was this very brief period, and it is brief, where the Chinese government worked very well with the foreign ambassadors. And it's largely because of Burlingame. The Chinese liked him so much that in the 1870s, the Chinese made Burlingame a Chinese official and sent him to the United States and to Europe as its official envoy. So he was representing, so he started out representing the United States in China, and at the end of his career, he represented China in the United States, and he was really good. That's one of the high point in US-China relations. This was before the Chinese Exclusion Act. He would have opposed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Burlingame Treaty was exactly the opposite. It allowed for a lot of Chinese immigration to the United States.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah. So his name is Anson Burlingame, right?
Burlingame, yeah.
Puancheng, yeah. Chinese name is Puancheng.
Yeah, he started out as a congressman, mm-hmm. and yeah, I think he lost his, right around 1860, I think he lost his re-election bid, and Abraham Lincoln really liked him and so gave him this position.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one of the, there's a lot of, in history, there's a lot of bad guys, but Burlingame, I was fascinated. I remember I went to the Library of Congress and read all his papers, and he's one of the good guys.
Okay. So the next is actually a comment or about the Cushing Family Museum.
Yes.
From audience, Jiang Tao.
Yes, and Tao Jiang says, right, okay, one of the Cushings was the ambassador to sign the first treaty established with China, right? It has unequal terms. That's exactly right. So I have a whole chapter in the book on this. So this is Caleb Cushing, whom you are referring to. Caleb Cushing is a distant relation to John Perkins Cushing. They're not like direct cousins or anything like that. It's distant. But Caleb Cushing was from Massachusetts. And yes, he was appointed so essentially here's what happened. After the Opium War, England secured a really strong treaty from China. It opened up 5 treaty ports. It gave England Hong Kong. One of the most important treaties probably in Chinese history, if not the most important. So that made the United States very nervous because the United States was a competitor of England. People don't realize this, but during the 19th century, the United States had a relationship with England almost like the Cold War of the 20th century. They competed for trade. And so the China trade was huge, very important. And suddenly England had, because of this treaty, this wonderful advantage. So the John Tyler administration, and John Tyler is not one of our more famous presidents, but he did launch the Caleb Cushing mission. So it's shortly after the Opium War, around 1843 or 1844. Cushing went to China and he secured a treaty. My research suggested that he tried to one-up the British. In other words, get everything that the British had and something else out of competition, and that something else is what the nice person who asked the question was referring to, he was able to get something called extraterritoriality, a really long word, extraterritoriality. And what that meant was that if an American in China was accused of some kind of a crime, stealing or murder, then what would happen is the American would be tried not in a Chinese tribunal, but in an American tribunal. So the Americans would try their own people, and that's extraterritoriality. Now, at the time, I've read the Chinese documents. Why would China agree to that when they didn't have to? And at the time, you can understand their logic. They agreed to extraterritoriality because Chinese officials found foreigners very vexing, very frustrating, hated dealing with them. And if somebody committed a crime, the Chinese said, well, it's your problem, you deal with it. We would much rather you deal it than we have to deal with it. But unfortunately, what happened was it created the unequal situation that was in the question. Americans could go to China, commit crimes, and not get punished. And the Chinese were powerless to punish foreigners in their own midst. And after the Americans got this, it was called the Treaty of Wangsha in 1844. The other foreign powers, France and England, quickly demanded the same thing. Excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you. The next, yeah.
He
mentioned the Wangsha Treaty, yeah.
Okay. There's an easy one there about books. So Lily Yao says, I'm only seeing book. Right, so go in the Temple Press, you should see two. There's, gosh, I feel really shameless hawking my own books here. But so the material for this presentation came from America's First Adventure in China. So it has all the early trade, it has the opium, it has tea, it has the Caleb Cushing mission, it has the Burlingame. So it goes from the 1780s all the way up to the about 1880 or so. And then very recently, just about a few months ago, I published another book with Temple called Cultures Colliding: American Missionaries, Chinese Resistance, and the Rise of Modern Institutions in China. And this book covers the period from about 1860 to 1900. And it essentially answers the question, why did missionaries start building colleges and schools and hospitals in China? In 1860, missionaries were all about the Bible. They just wanted to convert you. That's it. They didn't want to, they weren't doctors, they weren't teachers. And then in the 20th century, you see all these missionary colleges like Beida, Beijing University is founded by American missionaries. Tsinghua University is founded by American missionaries. So this book tells the story of how that happened. So thank you for giving me a chance to plug the book there.
Okay.
So there should be two books and you can get 25% off of both of them. I think you'll enjoy reading them. I like to tell stories and I like to really help readers get to know people from the past. So if you like that kind of history, storytelling, I think you will enjoy it.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody asked about Nathan Dunn's collection. Right, so it started in Philadelphia, it went to England, it stayed in England for a long time. Like it was very popular. It was still around in 1851 when England had the first World's Fair in world history, the Crystal Palace. But then something bad happened, which happened to a lot of great museums from the 19th century. Fire, burned down. So 99% of it was lost. However, if you really were to look closely in museums in the United States and in England, you will on occasion find an artifact or find a painting or something or a statue that is left over from Nathan Dunn's amazing museum.
Okay. There's one from Meichi.
Yeah. Okay. How much medical effects were known long term? Medical effects of opium. Did the British and U.S. government support the trade politically or mainly commercial interests? Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm not a British historian, but because England is, always a part of the story that I'm telling, I learned a lot. And England, that government definitely supported its opium trade. That war from 1839 to 1842 was to protect an illegal trade. So England, yeah, that government supported the opium trade. Not so with the Americans. American government kind of had a hands-off approach with its traders. You notice I kept making reference to something called the British East India Company, and that's because in England the government sponsored official trade. The British East India Company was an arm of the British government handling trade. Not so in the United States. The United States traders from the very beginning were all independent private traders with no connection whatsoever to the government. And the problem with that, I suppose, is if the government didn't want them to engage in the opium trade, the government couldn't stop them. So the American government did not support England, and the American government, the American people were against the Opium War. If you read newspapers from 1840, 1841, you'll see that. Americans could be kind of Christian and moralistic, and they said, well, it's a sin. It's a sin to try to get another country hooked on narcotics. So it was just a black and white issue with many of them. But the government was not powerful enough to stop it. I will say this, Caleb Cushing, so it had the bad thing in Caleb Cushing's treaty, 1844, was extraterritoriality, but it did explicitly ban American traders from bringing opium. That's different from the Treaty of Nanjing, England's treaty, which made no, if you read the Treaty of Nanjing, you'll see it does not make any mention of opium, even though the whole war was about opium. No mention of opium. The word does not appear. So the American treaty is different. It prohibits opium. The British treaty does not. Now, again, I just said the American government was kind of powerless to stop its traders. American traders kept bringing opium after the Opium War and after their own treaty with China banned the opium trade. It didn't stop them.
Okay, one question from Meichi. We talk about opium trading with China, right? Why didn't other countries such as Japan or other Asian countries have opium problems?
Yeah, Japan. So, while all of this was going on, Japan was closed. Now, I described China as a closed country, the Canton system, but it wasn't quite closed because you could trade, you could conduct trade in China. Japan was completely closed. I think Japan only allowed, once every year, every 2 years, they would allow one Dutch ship to enter Japanese ports. That's it. So it really was a hermit kingdom until an American, Commodore Matthew Perry, forced open Japan in the 1850s. And when Japan opened up, they were very observant of what was happening in China, and their government made a point of not letting foreigners become too powerful in your own country. So one could say that Japan learned from China's misfortune.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, since the time right now, we have only 3 minutes, maybe just last question. Thank you so much from audience Ding Wei Ding. Thank you so much for the great presentation. What could be learned from history to help handle the current US-China relationship today?
Oh my gosh.
That's a big question.
Well, first of all, I did see one small question there, which I can address real quickly because it has to do with the Caleb Cushing.
Yeah.
Somebody who really knows their stuff said there was one exception to extraterritoriality. What was that? And that person is right. The one exception was opium. So if an American, if he were caught smuggling opium into China, he would be tried by the Chinese and not by the Americans. Oh gosh, the what can be okay? What can be learned? Well, I don't know if this comes from history so much as my own personal experience. I've lived in China a couple of times, and I always think that it's important to remember that China and the United States actually get along really, really well. And even though this was a sad chapter, but there's a lot of really good chapters in Chinese-American contact. I mentioned Burlingame, and there's other good things as well. And even during this time of trading, there's a lot of wonderful friendships that emerged between Chinese and Americans. I think that the Chinese and Americans are actually natural friends and allies, the people I'm talking about. We're very similar in some ways. We like pop culture, we eat too much, and we like trading with each other a lot. And I think it's important to remember that sometimes governments may lock horns, but that doesn't mean that the people from the two countries need to antagonize each other. Again, I think that they're natural friendships.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you again, Professor Haddad. It's a very great presentation, and I believe we have learned a lot from this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. And again, if anyone wants to reach out, please just send me a message. And if you have trouble buying the book, send me a message too, and I'll make sure that you get the discount.
Yeah. And again, this session is recorded, so we are going to share the video with all in case you don't remember the email address or. But okay, yeah. And I'm going to announce the next webinar, which is on next Saturday, same time. You can use the same login Zoom information to log in. And in fact, today, May 6th, is the day, like 141 years ago. You just mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? It was actually signed on May 6th. What's the year? 18 something, right?
1882.
1882, yeah. So yeah, and it's 141 years ago, and nowadays I think many Chinese Americans know that some land bills raised in Texas, in Florida, Missouri, and some other states is similar to this thing. It just single out a few countries, right, forbidden them to access to the properties here. So the next seminar, we are going to talk about the land bills across the United States. And we have a strong panelists. We assembled like the state reps, state representatives, some activists, and from many states. They are going to talk about how to fight for our equities So next Saturday, same time, we'll see you again.